One of the biggest challenges that we're facing as teachers at the English Language Institute is how to engage students online. It's one of the questions that we get asked most often. And it's true, it is challenging. We've gone from classrooms that look like this to classrooms that look like this, often black boxes on a Zoom screen. And it definitely feels more difficult to engage students when we're looking at a screen rather than warm bodies in our classrooms. But not everything has changed. One thing that hasn't changed is language acquisition. And this is Bill Van Patten writing long before coronavirus, saying essentially that what we need for teaching language is exposure to communicative input, time for processing, time for reorganizing the mental language system, lots of output, and of course, interaction with other speakers. There's no way around it. And that's what we do. But we can do that online just as much as we can in the classroom. So I think that what we are seeing is that language acquisition has stayed the same. And all the things that were engaging about language acquisition, the input, the output, the interaction with others, all of that can be achieved online, although perhaps in slightly different ways. And Van Patten would know, he's a diva. It says so right there on his coffee cup there. So the model of motivation I want to share here is the one developed by Zoltán Dörnyei, professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. His model of motivation for L2 learners, I think, is extremely important and very useful because it's a dynamic model. For Dörnyei, motivation is not a fixed property of the student. So for him, in this approach, it is not enough to say that Fred has no intrinsic motivation or Marie is purely instrumentally motivated. In this approach, motivation is not just changing all the time depending on the situation, but it can be influenced by the classroom setting. In other words, it's moving away from an idea that motivation is something purely that the student brings to the classroom and towards an understanding that motivation is something that we can influence and affect and perhaps even create by the way we set up our classrooms and in our interactions with students. This helps us see motivation as more than just reward and punishment. There are other ways of dealing with online motivation and engagement. So what I'm going to do in this little talk here is show you how I'm thinking about Dörnyei's model through the lens of the online, predominantly synchronous instruction that we're doing at the ELI. So there are 4 stages to Dörnyei's model, and it's a cycle. It starts with creating motivational conditions, and we do that online through setting expectations, and much of this is stuff we already did in the classroom. We've just got to do it slightly differently, maybe even more so now that we're in Zoom boxes. So for example, in our Canvas template, we have an orientation module with activities that not just get students familiar with using the technology, but start to build connections between the students, among the students, and between us as teachers and the students, humanizing the whole process. The online classroom, of course, has an atmosphere, and we have to create that just as much as we do in the regular classroom through human interaction. With our Canvas sites, we've proposed a homepage, which everyone is using, in which there's a picture of each instructor and a little bit of information about us. And that may seem trivial, but it's really not, because it makes it clear that this isn't just a faceless space. It is a human space of interaction and language learning. And finally, if students are going to have the motivational conditions, they've got to be able to use the technology. And obviously, any technology used, we have to assume we have to train students how to use it. So the second step, once those initial sort of foundations of motivation are set, is to generate what Dörnyei calls initial motivation. And that's that sort of push off the blocks to get started. So this means starting every class with student activity. I think it's really, really important, just as it was in the face-to-face classroom, but maybe more so, that those first few minutes of a class are spent with the students doing something, not just listening to the teacher, because that way we set up the expectation from the very beginning of each lesson that the class is going to be interactive and dialogic. It's going to require students to participate. And this might be using the chat box, it might be using Zoom's reaction emojis, the thumbs up, the smiley face, and so on, using a breakout room, or simply going around the room and asking each student to speak up into the microphone in turn. I found I do a lot more icebreakers, and I do them for a lot longer into the session than I would have done in a classroom. Again, building that motivation through interaction. A good piece of advice that we have in our online course is to remind ourselves as teachers to interrupt ourselves to promote interaction. So anytime we feel we've been speaking for a long time, to stop and use the chat box, a quick poll, an infogap activity, a role play in breakout rooms, because again, the more that we fall into this monologic one-way interaction, the more students will sort of resort to just listening and absorbing and being passive rather than engaging in the activity that we need for language learning. Anytime any of us introduces a new tool in Canvas, whether it's Quizlet, Padlet, Perusal, whatever it is, it's really important to provide low stakes, ungraded practice to generate motivation with it and not the fear of doing poorly on an assessment. And again, slightly more so than in the regular classroom, perhaps, every online activity has to have a really explicit connection to the learning outcomes and to the assignments so that the students know why we're doing this. Because in the online, especially those asynchronous components, there's just more of that, so what? Why should I do this? And students are right to ask that question. The third step is maintaining and protecting the motivation we've built. An important way that we're recommending to do that is through the daily Canvas announcement, an announcement sent from the learning management system, from Canvas, saying, okay, this is what we're going to do in this class. These are the links you'll need. These are the pages in the textbook, and these are the homework activities or online asynchronous activities to do before the next class. You can go further than that and help students by making a weekly schedule so that they know when they're going to do all the work, the live classes, the asynchronous work, and the homework. Pauline Gibbons talks about the importance of message redundancy, of giving the same message multiple times, because frankly, we miss them. It's like the way your GPS reminds you 4 or 5 different ways before you have to turn off the interstate. So this means putting due dates not only in the text of an assignment, but in the actual calendar box, so it appears on students' to-do lists, also explaining it orally and putting it in daily and weekly announcements. It's not hand-holding, it's just good practice for helping students stay organized as they're being deluged by online information. Experts in online education recommend that when we use things like discussion boards and perusal threads for asynchronous instruction, which is a good thing to do, that there is a teacher presence. And it's a really tough balance between stepping back so that students can interact amongst themselves and being present so that we're encouraging them, motivating them, showing that we're listening, we're reading, and pushing them to say more and think more deeply about the topics. When the asynchronous component has, say, videos and readings, or even if it's just homework as part of the synchronous class, again, part of protecting that motivation is making sure there's always an activity to do, some kind of response or quiz or interactive quiz or discussion board or note-taking or preparation for the class. Obviously, we want students to be accountable for doing the work, but we're motivating them to do it in this way. Finally, EdTech experts talk a lot about the importance, even more so online than in person, of providing some degree of choice and autonomy. And why not? Students are choosing to spend their time with us in this rather complex format. Finally, the last stage of Dörnyei's cycle is to encourage reflection and self-evaluation so that students are motivated by their own sense of progress and developing self-efficacy. This can mean doing maybe a little more cheerleading than some of us are comfortable doing in the classroom. It's not my way of teaching really, but maybe this is a place to do a little bit more drawing of attention to students' successes. That could mean, for example, quoting students' online comments in class or in daily announcements, the really good stuff or interesting ideas that they've written in discussion boards or recordings or other online activities. When students are obviously not motivated or interacting, doing that early intervention by nudging them either through the chat box or emails or face-to-face meetings to encourage them to engage and find out what the obstacle is, whether it's personal or technological or due to their motivation for the class. Flexibility and agency again come in here because students are able to then evaluate what they're doing and reflect on where they should be going next. And having more of that reflection, for example, through a weekly survey, what did you like, what did you do well, what could you do better, or discussion boards, or just checking in class using reactions, having students think about the way they're learning online because they have to choose to engage just a little bit more so than they would have done in the classroom. And of course, if all that fails, we can resort to the classroom technique of putting motivational posters on the board. These from a recent McSweeney's article. I particularly love "We're self-esteem super spreaders." Well, maybe not that. So to review then, the Dörnyei model, and it is a cycle that it has to keep going because motivation is dynamic and therefore motivating students is dynamic. Creating those basic motivational conditions from day one, generating initial motivation, not just at the beginning of the course, but the beginning of every lesson, every unit, every module, maintaining that motivation so that the enthusiasm doesn't lag as we go through the course, and encouraging students to reflect on their progress, evaluate both their progress and the online components so that we're all working together towards constant self-improvement. I hope you find that useful. Good luck with your online teaching.